first time with my husband, John Wright, at Red Beet Row. We have an education farm there where we teach classes on how to grow food in non-toxic, holistic ways. Our website has PowerPoint presentations like this on it. Our website has seed-saving information, first-time gardening information, fertilizer information, all kinds of good stuff. Our other classes are on there too. We haven't had anything posted for our farm yet, but we will later. When things dry out, then we'll invite people to come over to our farm, but not until later in the season. And John does private consultations and stuff like that. So he went to school for horticulture. He's a huge plant nerd. He's got lots of good information to share. Good person to pick brain about. And just to remind you, we have a seed library here at the Kingsville Public Library. So anyone can donate seeds, anyone can take seeds. They take all seeds. So please donate seeds to the Kingsville Public Library. Thanks for coming. On to John.
All right, hi everybody. I'm actually going to stand back here just because I need to be able to work the computer for the slides, and it's all going to be happening up there anyway. I'm not going to be doing any dancing or singing today. I know, right?
Thanks, John.
So the reason that we decided to do the workshop on apples is because specifically where we live here, and I grew up about 5 miles south of here off 193, there are apples everywhere. There are wild apples, there are old orchards, there are crab apples that are native that are all over the place. So we are really in the seat of apple country, where apples want to grow with less work than they do, let's say if you go out to Phoenix, right? Apples don't like to grow out there very well. People still try in their commercial orchards, but they don't just drop their seeds and start growing, you know? So we're in a really kind of a neat place. Apples are our crop. Whenever you can go and find apple orchards, like there are Brants, right? There's like 3 or 4 different apple orchards close by. When you see that happening, you can say to yourself, okay, this is a plant that wants to grow here, right? You got to go all the way up into Michigan before you start seeing people growing cherries and things like that. So this is our crop. And specifically in my family, my dad's parents grew up in Appalachia. My dad grew up in Appalachia in West Virginia. And apples were very important to those people as a preserved product. Specifically in apple butter and in cider.
Apple jack.
And hard cider. Right. So these are pretty much currency as you go down in Appalachia. You don't have to go into too far of an explanation before people understand what you're talking about. Right? Or they know somebody who has apples, or they know somewhere where they get apples every year. So I feel like apples are in my blood. And thankfully they're sort of want to grow here. Like I said, we're in apple country. So let's get right to it. This is the apple. These are some pictures from the trees behind my parents' house. And basically what you're going to look for when you want to identify the apples, right? They start to bloom in April, May. And the flowers range from white, pink to red. You see that leaf, that little elliptical shape, right? The edges are serrated. See, it looks like a knife blade. That's one thing that's distinctive of the apples and even the wild crab apples that we have that go around here. So that's the apple. Now, the sort of the history of the apple, where our domestic apples come from, are Central Asia and Kazakhstan, specifically southeastern Kazakhstan. The apples in their wild habitat the place is very dry. They don't get nearly the kind of moisture that we have here, right? It's awfully wet during 9 months out of the year here. 6 to 9 months is pretty wet. And in the places where apple trees are growing naturally, it's much drier. So there's a lot less of the diseases that we have to deal with here with apples in these places because it's much drier. So fungal and bacterial diseases need moisture in order to really flourish. The apples that grow wild in Kazakhstan I should say the apples are in the rose family. So they're very closely related to pears and peaches and roses and raspberries and
Like rose hips.
rose hips.
Yeah.
They're in the same family.
Wow.
Yep. They're in the same family. And all the flowers, how they sort of separate a lot of these plants is by their flower. The number of petals, the number of stamens in the middle, right? So the wild apple trees here are a specific species. And the genus is Malus for apples. And these are Malus siversii, right? So this is sort of thought to be not necessarily what all of our domestic apples are around here, but a major species in the domestication of the apples. So these apples are nearly the size of modern day apples that we get, but this is one species. So a lot of the breeding that's been done over the last 4,500 years in apples has been by taking this apple and crossing it with oftentimes local apples, right? So our wild local crab apple here is Malus coronaria. It has little green fruits. They're about the size of a $50, right? And they're a very thorny plant, only gets about 10 feet tall. And it grows around in the fields, at least all around our place. There's wild apple trees. So by these two species crossing with each other, and not just that, but different wild crabapple species crossing with this domestic apple is what has produced all of the variety of apples that we have today, which is huge. One of the books I brought today is Apples of North America. And there's 150 profiles of just species that Thomas Jefferson was growing at Monticello. So that's a very small slice of the total apple varieties that are out there. But there's a huge amount, and they're bred for every region. So there are apples that grow here in the Northeast and Midwest. There are apples that grow in the humid Southeast. There are apples that grow out in Phoenix and Tucson, right? There is a huge apple culture in the Northwest. In Washington State, a lot of the apples we buy in the grocery store come from that part of the world. So that's a little bit of the sort of natural history of the apples. And I should tell you too, these forests where the apples grow wild, there's also wild walnuts and wild chestnuts and apples and pears and peaches. Like there's lots of different fruits that come from these regions. It's really a wild place. I have friends that I'm not too far separated from that have been there that have told me all sorts of crazy things about it. There's just food falling from the forest all the time. The people are gathering it and selling it in the markets. One of the major capital cities in Kazakhstan in the south is called Almaty, and Alma is the word for apple in their language. So they actually named the city after the apple, right? Because there's so many. So that's sort of the natural history of the apple. It's kind of fascinating. But the one thing that we should take away for sure is that it's much drier there than it is here, right? It's going to come in later for sure. So on to thinking about growing the apples and siting the apples. I've done this talk in cities, so that's why I have a couple of these pictures of the city up, because actually growing apples and fruit in the city can work really, really well. There's a lot of concrete, right? And the concrete heats up in the sun and then takes a long time to actually let that heat go. Much like the lake does here, right? During the summer, the lake heats up and it stays, it's like this giant warm bathtub that we're standing right next to, right? So in the fall, we get a warm, long fall because of that lake there. We have a little bit warmer temperatures than other parts of the state, right? So that's a big reason why there's so many nurseries in places like Perry. They also have really sandy soils, and it's conducive to growing nursery crops. And grapes, and these apples that are up here. So not only the concrete but also in the cities and even suburban places like some, and even out here, where the houses are close to one another, the backyards are often fenced in, and that's really nice to have protection for your fruit from heavy winds, right? And inclement weather in general. So just by having these sort of barriers up around your trees, they do a lot better. So the top left is our property. We're putting a lot of trees out in the open. Well, it turns out, in the same respect, a lot of the trees that we plant along the edge of the forest line do a lot better than the ones that are just planted out in the open in the fields. Right? So when that wind is blowing, like last night when it was snowing and 20-some degrees, and the wind's blowing, and you would never want to be out there, those trees are out in the middle of the field taking all of that, the brunt of that aggression, right? Whereas the trees that are closer to the wood line are protected by the forest behind them. Right? So this is a good way to start thinking about microclimate. Also, depending on which way the sun is facing is going to make a big difference too. Right? So this, in that top left picture, that forest that's off to the left is actually facing west. So as the sun reels around the sky to the west in the afternoon, there's a lot of heat that's accumulated there. Right? Whereas if that forest was facing east, I would only have the sun in the morning, and it's still cooling off the air from the night. It's much cooler. Right? Whereas the sun hitting it directly in the west, the heat is accumulated over the day, and we're in the afternoon, where, you know, it's like 3 o'clock in the summertime. It's hot. Right? But 9 a.m. on the east side of your house when the sun's first coming up, it's not really hot, even when it's one of those 80-degree days. It hasn't gotten hot yet. But once it gets around there to the west side of your house and on the south side of your house, it's going to be hot through most of the day. So that's where we want to start thinking of sort of microclimates.
Excuse me.
Yes?
It just, that's what confuses me because I would think that you wouldn't want them on the west side because of the wind.
We do have prevailing winds that come from the northwest. But it's sort of like, it depends on where you live. Like those prevailing winds, if you live up by the lake, are hellacious.
Yeah.
But as you get further inland, it's much less of a problem. Especially where I'm at. So right behind this picture is the forest, which actually sits on that northern and western edge. So if you have a fence line there, if you have houses there, if you have a forest there, that place is going to be much more protected. Because those things are actually taking up the brunt of that force. Whereas imagine living right on the lakefront. You're getting all those heavy winds coming in from Canada. If you plant the trees right out by the lake, they're taking all of it. Right? And that's totally different from you being 5 to 10 miles inland and having a whole bunch of stuff in between you and them. The prevailing winds are still happening. But they're just mediated by these other things there, to a great extent. You can plant, and if you have an open place like this, let's say you do live on the lake and you're taking all the wind coming in, you can plant things that don't mind being a windbreak. There are plants that will grow fast and strong in that situation, and they'll provide protection for the more tender trees that you want to grow. Right? So you can sort of think of it that way too. So the microclimate can add a whole lot to what we're trying to do. For sure. So the wind, that can actually be your friend to a great extent, because a lot of the fungal bacterial diseases need a stagnant, moist air to really infiltrate the plant. So a lot of our pruning, what we're going to be doing in pruning, is going to be to open up the tree so that more airflow gets through. So airflow to a certain degree is helpful, and too much of it is not good either. So it's sort of like trying to find a balance in there is really important. And it depends on where you live. If you're on the lake coast, right on the coast, it's going to be different than where we're at, 5 to 10 miles inland. So that's microclimates and where to site. Really wet places too. The trees that I've seen growing wild will grow in unbelievably wet places that I would never, ever, ever put an orchard. It's crazy. The wild plants will do that kind of thing. But most of the books that you're going to read on growing fruit trees and the information that you're going to glean very easily from the internet is going to tell you the opposite of that. Right? And I think that that's pretty sound advice. A lot of those pest and disease problems can also infect the tree through the crown of the tree actually being submerged underwater for too long. But like I said, I've literally observed with my own eyes over and over again apples growing in wetlands, wet places. So the plants don't read the books, right? So they don't know that they're not supposed to grow there. All right, moving on. So you decided where you want to plant the tree. So you're at planting time. I usually buy my trees as bare root trees. These are trees that have been grown out in the field and then dug up with their root system on, right? Like up in the top left there, the little picture. There are lots of places to get bare root trees. There's a few in Ohio that I haven't tried yet. You were mentioned someplace in Ohio that sells bare root trees.
Setters, I think it is.
It's called Setters?
Setters.
Where are they at?
Like Perry, I think.
Oh, wow, that would be really close.
So every year if you look in the paper, they'll advertise it.
Okay, so I've been looking for a local source, and this might be it here that we're talking about today. But I've also ordered trees from places all over the country because I'm really trying to get high quality trees. And one of the best places I've found for bare root trees is out of Maine. It's called Fedco trees. And they sell bare root trees already grafted. You can buy rootstock trees if you want to do your own grafting, but they're very large, healthy trees with big root systems on them, right?
There's a nice place in Ashtabula.
I've heard of that. My dad goes there.
Very nice.
Yes, I've heard of that. The one thing that we do want to watch out is buying plants in pots. Oftentimes we'll go to Tractor Supply, right, and you see I shouldn't mention names. Sorry. We'll go to all these different big box stores, and they have. And they have trees in pots, right? But a lot of times you have a little 2-gallon pot and a 5 or 6 foot tree inside of that pot, right? And when you pull that tree out of the pot, the roots are circling around themselves. And that can be really dangerous for the tree. It can actually strangle itself. If those roots get wrapped around the crown, they can kill the tree really easily. And unless, when you plant the tree, you really have to pull that apart to a great extent so that those roots can flare out, right? So it's just harder to find high quality stock that's in pots. And for me, getting a shipped tree that's going through the mail that I'm paying shipping for, the bare root trees weigh almost nothing. It's literally a stick with some roots on the bottom, so the shipping is very, very low, which is what I'm looking for too. So we want to dig the hole 2 to 3 times the size of the tree, right, and really loosen up the edges of that hole. We put the tree in the hole at the soil line. This particular plant on the right has a little bit of a mound there. So if you're in a wet place, like most of us are probably in here, right, the soil's very heavy, right? It's good to actually have the crown of the tree a little bit higher, because that crown, that part that's right where the roots and the stem sort of come together, like the roots turn into the stem, that part right there is very important to stay above the water line. The crown, if the crown is underwater for too long, they can rot, right? This is sort of what I was getting at with the plants growing in the wetlands. They're not supposed to be able to do that. Go ahead.
I always heard that when you plant the trees, the part that you're talking about before, right?
Yes.
I always heard that you were supposed to keep that above ground.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, insofar as mounting up.
So right around the base of the tree, you don't want to put the dirt up around the base of the tree. But you do want the crown of the tree to be up.
Point to like where it looks like the graphic, like soil is above.
Yeah, so this is a bad graphic, in that this soil right here shouldn't necessarily be up against the tree. It should come down right to about here.
Okay.
So you'll see where the tree was planted in the nursery. There will be a line where you'll be able to tell it was underground and above ground. So that line should not have soil above it. If there's wet soil up the stem of the tree, it can rot. And what also happens is it'll send down roots, and those roots will send up suckers at the base of the tree, and those can become very hard to manage. You can imagine a tree where you just have dozens and dozens of tiny suckers coming up at the base. So planting is, you definitely don't want the crown to be under soil, like you're saying. Thanks for bringing that up.
Same planting method if you're in sandy soil.
This is,
Oh.
yeah, and this might advance your slides.
Okay, that does. Perfect. I'll stand up here. Yeah. The other thing is, in the actual hole, we want to put the native soil back in. We don't want to necessarily add any kind of composted manure or any kind of amendments, like all this stuff that they're talking about on the side here. If you put anything on the top of the soil, we usually recommend composted manure or compost, and we put it on the surface of the soil. And we put it out as wide as the tree branches are. So if let's say we're planting a young tree and it comes out maybe 2 feet from the stem, we'll put compost in a ring 2 feet around that tree, and maybe just a few inches. On top of that, we'll use wood chips, we'll use straw mulch. We get rotten hay and bedding from farmers who are happy for us to take it off their hands, because oftentimes that just sits there and nobody takes it. So we use a lot of that for the trees as well. And that keeps the grass from competing with them so badly, because the grass will grow right up to the edge of the tree, and it competes with the roots for moisture. So most of the roots of this plant are going to be within the first 9 inches. And that's how it is for most plants. 9 to 12 inches is about where 90% of the roots are. The roots that are going below that they're mining. They're either mining water or they're mining nutrients. They're just looking to hit the jackpot, basically. They're looking to find the gold underground. So,
But if you're in sandy soil, John,
if you're in sandy soil, you have to worry about this mounding much less, because obviously the crown will be freely drained, right? If you have sandy soil, the water drains away, and this crown of the plant doesn't stay wet. But in the summertime, in sandy soils, you can dry out, right? This is the kind of soils where you might need to irrigate, whereas the rest of us in these heavy clay soils that stay wet for most of the year don't have to worry about irrigation so much in the summertime. But if you live in a place where it's sandy soils, that becomes an issue.
and the mulch is important.
The mulch is very important in sandy places. And literally sandy soils will eat mulch very quickly. They'll eat it. It just turns into soil really very quickly. As you get up to Route 20, on the north side of 20, all along between here and Ashtabula is beautiful sandy bottomland soils. Really, really nice. It used to be the old beachfront like 10,000 years ago. The same in 84 is the same kind of way. We're up kind of on a ridge here. So that's planting. And your orchard ends up looking like there on the left in the first few years. That's a pretty familiar sight for me to see.
You gotta protect those probably from
Yes.
your...
I didn't put anything about protecting the trees in this, but yes. Yes, we always have to protect our trees. So the deer are going to want to eat your trees more so in the wintertime. Yes. Like when the snow's on the ground and they don't have access to as much of the grass and the other things that they're eating, they're going to go for your trees, they're going to go for the bark of your trees, and the mice and rodents will do the same thing. They will eat the bark at the bottom all the way around the tree and kill it. So what we end up using is 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch hardware cloth wrapped around the base of the tree, and then we'll use chicken wire or tree tubes. They're like plastic tubes that you can buy. They're very cheap. And a stake to protect those trees for a few years until they get up out of the browse line. So the deer can only browse to a certain height. So once they get 5 or 6 feet tall and they start going out like this, the deer have a much harder time eating them, and you can take off the first layer of protection. I usually leave the mice protection on for a few more years. Once that bark gets old and kind of corky and it takes on a different look to it, it gets kind of flaky, and older apple trees have a different bark than younger apple trees. So once that bark ages and gets sort of corky, the mice are not going to eat it. So, but it takes a few years for it to grow. It's kind of like going through puberty or something. The tree sort of changes. It starts to become a mature tree. So that's planting. It's very important. All right. So this is the thing. This is the thing I want you all to pay attention to, because pruning the trees is it takes a little bit of thought about how the trees are going to want to grow. So at the top you see sort of the correct pruning. What we're looking for is a tree that has its branches well spaced along the stem. Right? We want the first branch to start at about 3 feet, and those first branches start, and the next one to come up another 3 feet, and each tier sort of sets up that way until you get to the top of the tree, which you can keep at around 10 to 15 feet on normal rootstocks. But this is the other thing I was going to mention. You can get trees on all sorts of different roots. Some of them only get 6 feet tall. These are called super dwarfing rootstocks. The problem with those is that the vigor is reduced so much to keep that tree at 6 feet that if a big wind comes, they'll blow right over. And they have a lot of fruit on them. You know, there'll be a lot of fruit, heavy wind, tree falls right over. So the smaller your rootstock, the more the tree needs protection, help, some kind of staking to keep it upright. But the thing that we want to think of when we're pruning is that these leaders, and you can see right here, A, B, and C, all of those branches in this little graphic right here, they're all competing to be the top dog, to be the top of the tree. They're all competing with each other. Right? It's called apical dominance. They all want to be the dominant branch that is the center of the tree. You know how trees grow, right? Straight up. This tree is trying to have multiple stems going straight up instead of just one. Like we think of the pine trees and the spruce trees, this one single stem, our Christmas trees, right? So for this tree to grow really well, it needs to have one stem and not several. And you can sort of see down there at the end what we get if it does have several stems. We get a very crowded tree. And if the tree is crowded, then there's no airflow. If there's no airflow, we have a lot more pest and disease problems. And those go hand in hand because oftentimes when a tree is stressed from a pest or a disease, it sends out pheromones and it calls in other diseases and pests, basically. Once it's open and it starts to get sick, it can get sick from all sorts of different ways and angles. So we're looking for a tree that is wide open. So we're looking to spread these out. You can see on each side where those branches come in the middle, they're about 2-3 feet from each other. And that's what we're looking for. It gets good airflow through the tree. And then it's just about thinning the branches as they do. See, you can up here, the branches just need thinned every year. After you get this good framework going, you don't have to do very much. So the trees are pruned in the wintertime. This is another thing I should mention. I just finished pruning a lot of our trees. There's still time to do it, basically before the leaves start to come out. So if you have a tree that's like this, starting to remove, especially the center one, right? Just by removing that, how much more airflow would we get in there? So this is sort of the way we can start to think of pruning or remediating our trees. When you do make a cut, you want it as close to the stem as possible. We'll go on to this next one. Yes. So here's sort of the tree, a well-trained tree, that we would be sort of just doing some remediative pruning on. The stub is very important. We don't want to leave any stubs. I had to fight with my father for years about this. The stubs don't heal over very well. So all of the cells in the tree are rapidly dividing right here. It's called the collar. And the branch comes out of the collar. It's sort of a wrinkled, it sort of looks like wrinkled bark right there. It's all squeezed together. So you want to cut as close to that collar as possible so that that tree can heal over. The faster the tree heals over, the less diseases and pests you have to worry about coming to the tree. Right? Especially those fungal diseases are going to, any opening in the tree, they're going to rush to. Right? So stubs we don't want. Any upright branches like this is a sucker. These branches will try to compete with the main top branch in the same way that we talked about those competing upright branches. So we want to take them out. There's one there, and that double leader at the top, that's what they're talking about there. Those branches are both competing for the same spot. We just want to pick one. Right? We have one leader. And a lot of these other branches that they're shown taking out are literally just crowding the branch structure. So if you start to get things coming up between your 3-foot branch scaffolds, they're called, then that one will come out too, right? A lot of these shoots that might come from the bottom, those are going to come out. Anything down here below this 3-foot where the branches start is going to come out, right? So after you get the tree trained, it takes a lot less work to keep it there, right? And one thing we want to avoid is up there at the top. And I see that all the time. Like all the time. People have a tree that is an old tree that they want to get it producing again, so they just start lopping off big branches. And you can see what happens there at the end. Oh, you know where it's a good place to see this? Along the power lines. How do those trees grow? That the power guys go and cut. They grow like crazy. They cut off one big stem and they have 50 small stems that take its place. So we don't want to be pruning like that. We want to be more strategic about the branches that we're taking out. And literally, if we just want to start opening up the tree so the air and light can get in. That's very important. Rather than lopping off everything.
When, if at all, do you top the tree? How high should the leader get? Because at some point,
Yeah, on a full-size tree, they can get 20. I mean, I was just doing some pruning for some friends, and they had almost 40-foot trees. They were massive. The base was massive, big. So trees can get that big. But as I'm going to show you, actually, this next, what we're trying to do is the branches that do come out, we want them to be at horizontal or below. That includes that top. So when we're ready for it to stop, like, okay, you're 10 feet tall, that's enough. That top branch that is the top dog that we talked about gets bent over too. So this is a weird concept, but basically what is happening is there's hormones in the plant. And those hormones are dictating where the energy is going. And I don't mean that in a metaphysical way, like woohoo energy. I mean literally the tree is photosynthesizing and it's producing sugars. Where those are going are dictated by the hormones in the plant. Right? So, by moving the branches from upright to horizontal, we move the energy in the plant from upright growth, trying to get high in the sky, to fruiting. And producing buds, producing more flowers. Right? And this also helps us significantly with pruning. Right? Because if more of the energy is going into the fruit and less of it is going into this upright wood, we're doing less pruning. And we're getting more fruit. That's what we're after. Yes?
I was in southeastern Ohio, and I may not have recognized what I was looking at, but it looked like apple trees that were on a trellis.
Sure. People do that too. There's so at 528 and 90, just south of there, maybe a quarter mile, there's a guy who has a big fruit farm, and all of his stuff are on trellis, pretty much. And they do that because when you have a dwarfing rootstock, like I said, they don't have the vigor. His trees maybe grow 10 feet, and that's as big as they're ever going to get. So they have reduced vigor. So if there's a windstorm or something comes through, they just can't take it, and they could fall over.
It actually looked like a grape vineyard when I first saw it.
Yes. And they'll train them along those trellis or horizontally for the same reason I'm talking about here, to move those branches from upright to horizontal and get the energy moved into fruit and less of it into that upright growth.
Can do that with any variety of apple tree?
Yes. Yes. And actually most fruit trees in general. It's amazing. Yes.
What can you tell us about the espalier when they grow?
Espalier?
Yeah.
Yes. So let's say that we wanted to grow some apple trees and we didn't have very much space. People will grow trees along a fence line, very close to the fence, and train all the branches horizontally. None of the branches are coming this way, right? They're all just along the fence. And you'll have maybe a tree here and another one 5 or 6 feet away, and they'll actually graft them together. So you have a tree with roots, branches going horizontal, a tree with roots, branches meeting up with that tree, and it's, oh man, I wish I would have had some pictures of that. But it's a way to grow trees in a small space. And it oftentimes uses that fence or houses. You can go to Europe. In France, there was a huge culture of growing peach trees in walls. They would put up these stone walls, and they grew the peaches right up against the walls because they needed extra heat to ripen the fruit really well. So it helps tremendously, like I said with the microclimate, to have the trees in such a place that they're protected. Well, the next level of that is growing espalier trees that are right up against the fences and buildings and things like that. Although the foundations and trees, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I'm told that it's not the best idea to just start planting trees right up against the foundation of your house. But there might be a fence line or some other kind of space where this would work well. A lot of the oldest espaliers that you see in Europe are on stone buildings. I think their foundations are a little different than what we're dealing with, but they're very close. And these are trees from the medieval, they're like 500 years old that have been grown that way. So to get the branches below horizontal, there's lots of different ways of going about it. I like something like this because you can still mow underneath it, but I've definitely seen people that will tie them straight down to the ground. Let's say you might have another tree that's 10 feet away. You might tie the trees together to they're holding each other's branches down, sort of. It doesn't really matter how you do it, just that you do it. And the time of year is basically when the trees are in growth.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So basically, May until September is when I keep them weighted down. And if you wait too long, the branches won't stay down. So if you try to weigh them down in July or August, oftentimes you'll take the weights off in October or November, and then they'll go whoop, and they'll pop back up. And they need to have several months in there, 4 to 6 months at least, where they're weighted down, or they won't stay down. But then once they're down, and they will start to put their energy into producing more buds, producing more flowers, producing more fruit, and less energy into these competing branches or this kind of stuff that's competing with the top. Less of this extraneous stuff in general, because more of the energy is going into fruit, which is what we want, right? We don't want to be out there pruning our trees for hours and hours. We want to be out there picking apples for hours and hours. So, and you go to that guy at 528 and 90, all of his trees are basically like this. They're set up on a trellis. And he just finished all of his pruning. Like last week, I just saw him pruning. So now is the time to do it. Yeah. So any other questions on, go ahead.
Just so I'm clear, so you have a mature tree that's 30 foot tall. Should you top it,
Cut it off.
should you cut that leader down, or do you?
Yes. And then what you want to start thinking of is when you cut a tree at this time of year, the growth is going to come from that point that you cut. Does anyone ever notice this? When you make a cut on a limb, right out of that space that you cut is where all the new growth is coming out. And sometimes there's 5 or 6 branches that take the place of the one that you cut off. I didn't mention it, but summer pruning is very, very important. So those branches that come and take the place of the branches that you took off in the wintertime need to be taken off in the summertime. Or they will become more pruning for the next year. Basically, everything just rolls over to the next year, and you have to prune it off the next year, and then they'll grow back the next summer. So you can get into this perpetual cutting off of shoots. So trimming the plants in the summertime of the new shoots that are growing in the places where you cut is very important. When you get regrowth, and let's say you want to keep that, like you're at the top of the tree, you cut that off, you have 5 or 6 that are going to replace it. Well, you might cut 4 of them and leave 1 and start training it horizontally. They're really easy the young new branches are really easy to bend down. Really, really easy. As you have an older tree that's stiffer, and the older branches, they're going to be a lot harder to bring down. It might actually be necessary to cut some of those older branches off, have a new one take its place, and then train that to a horizontal position. If anybody wants this PowerPoint, let Steph or I know, and we can.
The website.
It's on the website? Steph says it's on the website. Okay. Good.
I guess I don't have to take pictures.
It wasn't a apple tree, but a maple tree in our front yard. The township cut a big branch off, and the tree never did heal over. Is there anything we can do to help the tree along in that way? Because the wood that's in that spot is not protected, it's starting to rot away and everything.
So if you have a larger diameter, sometimes they don't heal over, or it takes a long time. I'll cut them at a bit of an angle, so at least the water runs off them better, but there are, the old timers would take mud and manure and smear it on there. And that would keep at least a lot of the pathogens, the fungal diseases, from going into the wood. But as far as getting it to heal over quickly, as they get to a larger diameter, it just takes much, much longer for that to happen. And it's usually with did they resprout?
No, the wood just kind of rotted. It was like 2 or 3 main branches came from one little spot,
Yeah.
and they cut that, and it's a whole, the size of a basketball or so.
Oh,
And
wow.
it tried to heal a little bit, but there's a big gaping hole in the tree now.
Yes. So there's this forestry practice called coppicing, where when you cut a tree, it regrows. And everybody's seen it. The power lines are the greatest example of that. Well, people used to manage forests in Europe that way for firewood and for all sorts of different things. A lot of building materials and things like that. And what they say is that over a certain diameter, trees don't grow back or coppice very well. So it's really younger trees that are going to grow back with a lot of vigor. Even old apple trees, like those 40-footer monsters that I was talking about, I have to be really careful about cutting off too big of a branches on those because they're not going to heal very well either.
Is there like a general threshold of like if more than certain?
It's usually over like 8 inches. But it's probably different for different species of trees. It's probably different for depending on what type of tree it is. What's that?
We were just talking about what we've been doing lately, the big branches we can cut off.
Well, they might be fine, and they just might make a bunch of shoots out of there. You have to manage those shoots to be horizontal. If you want them to be replaced, if you actually want to create space in there, you want to cut all the new summer growth off and not let it come back at all. Yep.
Put a spurt feeder on it.
Yeah.
Well, a neglected tree that hasn't been taken care of for years, can you ever bring it back to producing fruit?
You can. It's important not to take off too much wood at any one time. I usually do that over several years. But you can
I read
absolutely,
on YouTube, they say 20%.
yeah, you can, yeah, I just sort of like, you try to be reasonable about it. It's no more than a third of the tree what I want to take off in that biomass. And then when it's going to start to regrow in the summer, and that needs to be managed as well. And as long as you do that, then the next winter you can cut off more, manage the summer growth the next summer, and over a few years, you can start to clean out the inside of it so that air and light can get down in, and it'll start fruiting. And some branches you might have to take out entirely and replace with new whips that are growing, and you can start training them exactly where you want them, that's the nice thing about all of this, is that you can put the branch right where you want it, right? Yeah. So that's pruning. It's a big thing. People pay me to come out and prune their trees. And I try to do an education thing while we do that at the same time, but it's a lot. It's a lot to talk about. So if anybody wants to geek out on pruning some more, talk to me after. So some of the diseases that I've mostly had to deal with here, there are lots of apple diseases and apple pests, but I'm mostly talking about the ones that I've actually had to deal with in our orchards. These are fungal and bacterial diseases, and mostly they're cosmetic, which means that they make for a really ugly looking fruit, but the fruit tastes just fine. And honestly, they've done studies on the sap analysis of the fruit, and that's basically how much sugars are in the fruit, the bricks of the fruit. And they found that the fruit that has these cosmetic diseases on the skin actually has a lot more sugar inside of it. So plants produce sugar to protect themselves from things that want to eat them, and also from frost. It's sort of a stress response. When the tree is stressed, it produces more sugars. So I have trees that produce every year, and they only have a little bit of this. Some years it's worse than others, usually when it's wet. So think about those summers when we have rain throughout the summer versus the summers where we have kind of a dry, don't get much rain. That's going to make a big difference. When the rain comes makes a big difference as well. So the trees are very susceptible to diseases when they're cut and pruned, and also when they're flowering. So you can think of the flower as kind of like, almost like the tree is opening up one of its orifices or its mouth or something. And just like stuff can get in there and make it sick. Right? Because the bees are actually transferring the pollen from another tree into this tree, or from that tree to this tree. So they're open. They're receptive. They're receiving the pollen. And they're giving pollen. So there's like an opening almost that's happening there. So during that period, it's very important that we have sort of dry weather. So when the trees are flowering, that's what we're looking for. And we don't always get it. That's the thing about this stuff. We're within this natural system that brings us rain when we don't want it, and brings us no rain when we do want it. Right? Go ahead.
Is that apple more susceptible to insects the way it is?
It probably is.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the trees put out, when they're being attacked by a disease or an insect, they use pheromones that are in the air to tell the apple trees that are near them that there's something that's going to eat you. So the apples that are near them will actually produce more sugar without even before they're even attacked. Right? So they'll start to boost up their immunity and their protective mechanisms before they're even attacked, based on the trees around them sort of talking to each other. So yeah, that's it definitely could be more susceptible. It seems like they kind of, when they're bad, it's all bad. Like when I have all of these diseases, and it's been a really wet year, oftentimes we don't have insects that year because it's wet. The insects actually don't like it when it's wet. And then the years when it's really dry, I'll have more insects because it's drier, and they can sort of like make their cocoons and things up in the plant life and not get drowned away. So it's different from year to year. Everything is, it's all based on the weather, right? So we're going to talk about how we control a lot of these diseases too. We're getting to that. This is fire blight. This is a really devastating disease, especially on pears. Right? When you start to see the shoots die back from the tip down, you need to cut out the growth at least a foot from where it stops. Because that disease is systemic. It's inside the tissue of the plants. So we do a lot of trimming out of the fire blight. But as far as the fly speck, the scab, and the sooty blotch, we usually don't do anything for those. Other than the things that we're doing generally for the whole trees. And we'll show you at the end. The pests that I'm seeing are the top left is codling moth. A lot of birds eat codling moth. So things like blue jays and cedar waxwings love to eat codling moths. So we've done a lot to bring in fruit that makes them stay during the summer, and also things to keep them fed during the times of year when they first show up in the early spring. So they're happy. Bottom left is the apple maggot. So you can kind of see that the codling moth goes straight for the center, goes straight for the seed, right? Whereas the apple maggot is looking for the flesh, and the seed oftentimes is okay. So those are two that you can see by cutting open the apple, right? Both of them, neither of them are very, very nice. The top right is the aphids. So they're sap suckers. They're actually attached to the new growth of the plants and sucking the juices out of them. But they're pretty distinctive, and they're little tiny green guys. Sometimes they're black. There's lots of different types of aphids. And these guys down here are called, what the heck are they called? I forget what they're called.
Tent caterpillars?
They're called tent caterpillars. And we've had those, and basically I took a lighter and you light the whole thing on fire, and they're very, very quickly gone. We've only had to mess with the tent caterpillars just a few times, like maybe 2 or 3 times over the last 10 or 15 years. And the birds seem to eat them too. So they don't seem to last very long. The aphids, the ladybugs eat a lot of aphids on our trees. They totally took care of all the aphid problems, the ladybugs. The same guys that are living in the sashes of your windows and stuff right now? Yeah, those guys.
I'll catch some for you.
And those the birds are the main predators for them, for sure. Okay, so this is where we get to the interesting part. So the way that we deal with pest and disease problems are, number one is through proper pruning. We already talked about that. Just getting airflow through the trees helps significantly with fungal and bacterial pests, or diseases, excuse me. Not so much with the insect pests, but with the pathogens that are fungal or bacterial in nature, like the fly speck, all these guys. So there's a lot less of these on the trees when they're pruned well and there's airflow and sunlight, right? So you might see this on some of these trees, these older trees that we're trying to fix, but as you're pruning and moving a lot of that material out of there for the airflow, it's going to get a lot better. All we have a lot of wild trees on our property that we've started working with, and it's been amazing just in 3 to 5 years how much better the fruit looks than it did when they were just fruiting on their own and nobody was messing with them. Those wild trees are tough. They're really tough. They want to grow good fruit. So when you give them a little bit of help, you get some airflow in there, they're going to produce nice fruit for you. So pruning, yes. This is a thing that is a little bit more esoteric. It's harder for people to wrap their head around it, but I'm going to make it easy for you and tell you that your fruit trees should be close to other flowering plants, right? That might be your garden. It might be a flower bed. It might be a wild pasture, a field that's full of goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace, right? Having flowering plants nearby, having other trees and shrubs that produce fruit throughout the year, for the birds. The birds are going to do a lot of, think of it this way, especially with birds, they're out there working all day. While we're at our jobs working, they're hustling for those worms and grubs and anything that they can. So by putting the trees near where the birds are, whether it's the edge of the forest or the edge of the field or just where other plants are growing, we put these two things near each other. We put something the bird needs next to where the birds are. Right? And that's as close to making a connection in nature as we're going to get, I think. So we grow a lot of apple trees right in where we're growing vegetables and other plants. And it works out really well in that the other insects that are eating, that are predatory, like the ladybugs, and there's all kinds of parasitic wasps that are also laying eggs in those collie moths and the apple maggots. There's a whole lot going on that we don't really need to get into. All we need to know is that we need to have a diverse number of plants around our orchard doing work throughout the year. So they're flowering throughout the year, they're providing fruit throughout the year. You know that red twigged dogwood that's all over around here? Right? That produces fruit in the middle of summer. And not only ground birds, but birds that are in the air are eating that fruit through the summer. So that's important, right? To keep them around, to keep them interested. And it's all over the place here. It's ubiquitous with this area, I think. But it's just an example of a plant that's giving fruit throughout the year that we don't even really think of. Like most people are just like, it's garbage, it's everywhere. You know? It's like, you get numb to it when you just see these things all the time, but just having your trees near where these other things are happening makes a big difference. Really big difference. So diversity is really important. Not having all the same, unless you're growing an orchard that's commercial, like you want to sell lots and lots of apples, there's no reason to have the same exact variety of apple tree in your backyard. There are varieties of apples that start giving fruit in July, right? And they're continuing from there all the way to November. There are fruit from apples falling off the trees. There are apples that you eat right away. There's apples that store for a year, right? So if we're just growing apples in our backyard, we want a mixture of apples, right? When I'm putting in orchards for people, especially homeowners, and it's just a backyard thing, we're looking for as much lengthening of the season as possible. You know, those summer apples come in, and I want you to eat all of those before the next ones start to come, and those might be stored until Christmas. You know, but having fruit throughout the season makes a big difference for the homeowner. When you grow whole orchards of one type of fruit, right, it's kind of the same as growing a whole field of just corn or soybeans. When there's a pest that eats the corn or soybeans or the apples of that particular variety, it's a buffet. It's literally everything that they can eat for as far as the eye can see, right? So that, farmers need to recuperate their money that they've spent on that stuff, so they're having to spray to control a lot of that stuff. Well, you can get around some of it by planting diversity of crops, different types of apples. Then at least they're all different. That's the thing. Just like us, some of us have a strong, robust immune system. Some of us get sick very easily, right? And apples are the same way. You can buy disease-resistant apples. There's been a lot of breeding in the last 20 years that have been for disease resistance in apples, of the major economic diseases that apples get. So the Purdue University and Cornell has produced all sorts of varieties that make fruit that doesn't need to be sprayed and produces, it looks really nice. Tastes really good, right? Fedco sells those trees, by the way. That's another reason why I recommend them. So diversity is important. It's kind of weird, but literally just plant stuff near where the goldenrod and the red osier dogwood is and you'll be fine. Or you'll be in better shape. A lot of this stuff is about having multiple levels of things going on, right? We have to prune right. We have to have some diversity. And this next part, nutrition is really important. And this can get really heavy too. But a lot of the susceptibility of plants to pests and diseases are oftentimes because they have a nutritional deficiency. I've done a lot of soil tests in our county, and I know that zinc has been deficient in about half a dozen tests. Boron has been deficient, and what was the other one? Selenium has been deficient in most of the soil. So these are things that while plants don't need them in large amounts, they're called trace minerals because they need them in trace amounts. And even though they need very small amounts of them, they don't do very well without them. And we're the same way. Like, we need very small amounts of molybdenum and cobalt and nickel in our bodies, but it's not something you're going and buying from as a nutritional supplement, right? Because we don't generally think of that stuff, but really we need that stuff in order for us to function right and not get sick. So, soil testing is important. This is a company out of Lakeview, Ohio, on the west, way out on the west side, that does a full soil test with all the trace minerals. And I buy my minerals from, there's a guy in Mespo called DNS Organics, right off of 534. And they have all the minerals. So you can buy sulfur, you can buy potassium, phosphorus, and all that stuff. And I usually only recommend this stuff as a way for folks that have a big orchard, have tried everything else, they're pruning right, they have a little bit of diversity in there of insects and birds. This is, after you get to that point, it's like, and you're still having problems, then there's next steps that we can take. And that's basically what we're going for with this.
What about like compost around the tree? How often do you need to fertilize in that kind of way?
That's a good one. Thank you.
Is that coming up next?
Yeah. I'm glad he brought it up. This is the first time I've done this talk. Usually I do like a full fruit, all the different fruit trees, but this is, the first one is just apples. So I did leave out some things, but she's reminding me. So I'm glad. So basically, we will top up that compost every year, and we do it before the summer solstice. So before June 21st, we want to make sure that our tree is fertilized. If you fertilize a tree too late in the fall, or too late in the year, you don't want to be encouraging growth in August and September, because the frost is going to come very soon after that, and that new tender growth is going to be destroyed by the frost. So you want the growth to happen on your apples early in the year, so that by the time we're in September and we're getting close to where we might have a frost, September, October, the trees are hardened off. Those branches that they made early in the summer have become lignified and tough, so that they're ready for that frost when it happens. Right? That's important. But yeah, compost a few inches of it around the drip line of the tree. The drip line is how far out the branches go. So maybe they go out 2 feet, so you make a 2-foot ring around the tree. And I'll usually put some new mulch down and some new compost down.
Once a year?
Yeah, until the tree, it looks like it's happy and it's growing. You can kind of like, after a few years, you're like, okay, you're doing good. You're on your own. And I'll give them a few years to keep growing, and if they look like they're not growing real fast, I'll start giving them compost again. So we don't want to encourage too much growth, because too much growth is going to make the trees sort of swell up with water when there's too much growth. And that too much growth things want to eat that. It's the new succulent growth that the diseases and pests really want to get at. They're the ones my goats want to eat too. It's like the new green good stuff. That's everybody wants that. Go ahead.
Since we're just putting it on the ground, I dump just fresh horse and goat manure on that. Is that okay? Since it's
Yeah, fresh.
I just clean up the stalls and just go and dump it since it's on top.
You have to watch with the fresh stuff. Sometimes it can be too much.
Yeah.
So just doing it at the right time of year, and then observing how much growth you're getting. If you're getting excessive amounts of growth on it, you might want to step back a little bit.
Okay.
Or mix some of that fresh manure with some wood chips, or some sawdust, or some hay. Some things that are sort of brown and not super funky, like smelly, or green grass clippings turn into mush real quick. You want something that's like brown and dry to soak up the extra goodness from that fresh manure. Yeah.
What about root pruning?
So some people, you can prune the roots if you get bare root trees when you plant them, but usually I only do it to make them fit easier in the hole. I don't do it unless I really have to. Depends
What about
on,
later?
what's that?
What about later? I've heard people do root pruning once it's mature tree.
Oh wow, I've never heard of that.
No?
No, you'd have to do some excavating to get to the
I think there
roots.
was some chemical stuff you can do too for root pruning.
Maybe. I've never heard of that. That's fascinating. Go ahead.
What about your pH range and what we should be looking at to adjust that if it needs it?
So pH shouldn't be a problem for most people. The apples grow within a wide range of pH. If you have blueberries and pine trees growing there wild, naturally, then you might be in a place that's more acidic. But you're going to be most places in the region here aren't going to have too much of a pH problem with growing apples. They actually like a little bit of an acidic soil, and that's mostly what we have. Even in those sandy parts along the lake, they're quite acidic. So, but yeah, too low of a pH, that's where people grow like blueberries. They'll actually add sulfur to lower the pH of their soil. So you're adding sulfur to lower it, you're adding calcium, some sort of calcium source, lime, to raise it up, depending on where you're at. But around here, we shouldn't have to do that too much.
Doing soil samples, how far
Right?
do you do? Like, I've got like 7 or 8 acres of trees all over the place, so would you do like every corner or every?
So I would go through the field if I had, if all the trees were on like higher on a ridge and not down. If they're all in similar soil versus like the wet soil down in the valley versus the drier soil up in the ridge, you want to sort of test in that way. So if they're all down in the wet, you want to test all the wet space that they're in. If they're all up and dry, you want to test there where all the dry stuff is. If there was some up here and some down, if the soils are too different from each other, mostly it's going to be in how wet they are, then I test separately. But if even over a few acres, you can take a little bit from here and a little bit from there across your whole orchard. And as long as you're within that 9 to 12 inch where most of the roots are, it's usually 4 to 6 inches that I'm taking the soil from for the soil test. But you can take a little bit from through the whole orchard and then mix it all together. Yep. Once you get over, 5 or 6 acres, you might want to start doing separate tests. But it's only really when you know that the soils are distinctly different that you'd want to test separately. And often the vegetation tells you that. So if you have like a different type of forest that's growing in this spot over here versus over there, that's pretty indicative that you have little different types of soil. And often it's just the wetness. How wet it is dictates what's going to grow there versus in different places. And they give directions, especially Logan Labs gives great directions on how to do that. And these places, you can call them and ask them whatever questions you want. And they'll oftentimes, even if you're only sending in a $50 test, they'll sit and talk with you. I mean, I talked to a guy for 45 minutes before I decided I was going to go with these guys. And they're in Ohio. And AEA is also, they're down in Middlefield. And they sell a lot of minerals as well. And Crop Health Labs is like the next level stuff. If you have a large orchard, what large orchardists are doing now is taking leaf samples and doing sap analysis of the leaves, and that'll through the season. And by doing that, it'll tell you exactly what minerals are deficient in the plant at that snapshot in time, right at that time. And they will then buy liquid mineral fertilizers from AEA and spray right away. So they can actually monitor the plants through the season, because the plants are using different minerals as the season goes on. They have a high need for calcium at a certain time and a high need for zinc at a certain time. So they figured a lot of this stuff out now, and they make all the products for it and everything. These are the guys that do it. But this can be a little more higher. This is higher end stuff. So this is if you're really, like your livelihood is based on these apples growing really well, right? or you have just acres and acres of them and they need to do well. But for the backyard people, unless you're really serious about it, this is usually one of the, we don't get to this point because we can figure out a way to make the apples at least give us some fruit, you know, before we get here. So that's nutrition. It's also an aspect that's deep. Okay, so that's pretty much how we're dealing with the pests and diseases. It's through the nutrition, diversity, proper pruning, and the siting, proper siting in a place that has good airflow, right?
What's special about those books?
These are the two books that I use to a great extent. For this guy basically wrote the book on how to formulate fruit sprays sort of nutritionally, so instead of using pesticides and fungicides and that sort of stuff. His book is really great. It's sitting back there. You can read through it. And this one talks a lot about how to prune the trees really well. It comes from, so all of this pruning where we're making the trees horizontal comes from France. And there's a couple of French guys from French Canada that wrote this book. And I also like it because it has like how to prune walnuts and how to prune chestnuts and kiwis and all sorts of interesting stuff that are by themselves are hard to find information on. And quinces. But this talks a lot about the idea behind pruning, that philosophy behind pruning, how the hormones work, how to, all of that stuff if you want to go deeper into pruning. That's a really good one. Yeah. Okay. So this is how it used to be back in the day. The trees were 25 to 40 feet tall. It was a big old party when it happened. You had giant ladders. The same was true when they're pruning. These guys were out there in the wintertime. I've seen pictures of them out walking on the branches, pruning. They're 20 feet off the ground. So these growing trees on what they call standard rootstocks, they're full-size trees, produces a tree that lives a very long time. They're very strong in that if we have too much rain or not enough rain, or we have inclement seasonal variations of weather and diseases and pests, they're able to handle it a lot better. Just like I was saying, that apple trees I'm observing growing in the wetlands where they're not supposed to be growing, those seeds germinated right there. And there is something to be said about that as far as resilience and toughness in a plant. Like those wild plants that are growing out in the forest here, that seed fell and they germinated and they had to deal with all kinds of crazy adversities, and things that wanted to eat them and didn't want to let them grow. Right? And if their apple can make it through that, it's going to live a long time. It's going to live a lot longer than we do. And it's going to be able to handle most things that get thrown at it. Not that these plants don't die, but they're tough. They're robust. Right? Just like our forefathers and mothers that came here. Right? They're tough and robust. Bad people. Good people. I mean, you know what I mean. So we do a lot of our harvesting in milk crates, stack them up on the back porch, and then they go into, oftentimes we store as many as we can. You want to store most of these fruits in high humidity and low temperatures, so close to freezing, like 34 to 40, 89 to 100% humidity. Very humid, very cold. And that's how all the apples we grow we buy in the grocery store were not picked last month. They were picked oftentimes last year. They were picked, and they last until the next year because of the way that they store them, right? And that's some of the major storage. And you can see that each individual apple is kept apart from the other apples, and they're all on trays, set apart from each other. Nobody's touching, right? It's like one bad apple spoils the bunch. It really does. It really does. My grandparents are into apple butter. They make tons of apple butter every year, and that's one of the ways that people were preserving and storing the apples, right? The apple cider and hard apple cider is another way. That stores for a really long time. Once it's made into hard cider, you can drink it years later, right? And the same with this apple butter. We have apple butter probably 20 years old in our house, just because of the way my grandparents are. And green beans the same kind of way. It's like, who's going to eat Go ahead.
Are apples better when they're first picked as opposed to a year old?
Well, it's debatable. There are some varieties that are better when they're first picked. There are some varieties that get better in storage. So there are some varieties you wouldn't want to eat right off the tree, but 2 or 3 months in cold storage and they taste pretty good. So many of the commercial cultivars that we're buying from the grocery store aren't that great off the tree, but really do need several months of storage. And those are the ones that last for a year, no problem, in cold storage. Because they actually need it to do it. Go ahead.
When you preserve them and store them, is there a way that you can hold on to the nutrition, like the vitamins and minerals, and or is that affected at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that you lose some of that. You definitely lose a lot of fiber when you press out the juice from them. But people have also been drying. We've dried tons of apples. There are certain apples that taste like garbage off the tree that dry. Once they're dried, they're amazing. We've had several varieties that I didn't want to eat them, but then we dried them and they were really, really good. They were like that's what they were made for. And I think drying it would probably be the best way. Apple butter would probably be, I don't know how much you lose in cooking. You probably lose some. But,
Not much of the sugar.
oh yeah, all the white sugar, and probably not that great for you. This is a 25-gallon pot, and they put like 20 pounds of sugar in it, or some white sugar. That's what I said. But originally, the recipe that came from Europe for apple butter was just apples. And there's enough sugar in them as you break them down to actually store them and can them. I think that it's just people got used to putting sugar in stuff or something. I don't know what it is. This is how they make it now. Yeah. But it's kind of cool that it's in my family. They do it every single year, and it's lots of fun. But we dry a lot of apples. I think that might be a little better way to do it.
Up in the rack storage there on the left, you say all the apples aren't touching each other. Now, I don't have those specific racks. What could I use to keep the apples separate? Maybe plastic saran wrap or something more like newspaper? What would I use to keep the apples from touching each other that I would have easy access to?
Yeah, so I've seen them, they just make little boxes that are maybe 4 to 6 inches tall, and they're set in there just next to each other. I mean, you have to be careful when you stack them in, but you're only pulling out one at a time, sort of after you put them in. So you can just put them in a box like that, or they make these, you can buy the little foam inserts,
Okay.
like from packaging companies. And you can buy the little foam things they'll have like they'll be all nestled, they'll have a little spot for each apple.
Very dry straw, probably, if it's a local, your own personal stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't use the sawdust, or even sand would probably be okay. I mean,
Would newspaper work?
I don't see why not.
We usually end up just leaving them in their crates, and
Try to
honestly,
eat 'em all up.
and some of them will go bad, and that's how it is.
Yeah, we don't have the refrigerator space to store them like we need to. So we are drying a lot.
In the crates.
Yeah, we're drying a lot. We're putting them in the crates in the garage. And then so people have stored apples that way too, just in a big bin, but you have to go through them all the time. And you're going to find rotten ones halfway through. So it's more work to store them that way. To have to go through the apples and mess with them like that. It's just
You need a little bit of air when you're storing.
Yeah, the airflow between them is part of what helps. So, yeah, but they'll keep for months and months, for sure. I think that's it. That's all I got. Does anybody have any more questions about apples?
So do you really worry about pollinators then, where they say one brand or breed of apple needs another one for cross-pollination?
That whole genus, whether it's crab apples or domesticated apples, they'll all cross with each other. So, and they're self-fertile as well. So some of them need another apple tree to pollinate. Some of them will pollinate with no other apple tree around. It just depends on the tree. I usually recommend people have 2 or 3. And most apple trees, even if you have a fruit that's ripening in July versus one that's ripening in October, November, they're going to flower we're pretty close to one another. So we can have a few trees and get pollination off of most trees.
Are bees a must?
Honeybees are not a must. We have a lot of native pollinators. Those bumblebees that we see with the big furry butts that are flying around, those do a lot of pollination at lower temperatures than what honeybees would be out working. Honeybees are going to be out there when it's over 50, but a lot of our native pollinators will be out there even, it's going to get warm in the next few days, they're going to be out. So they're ready for the stuff to start blooming.
I use mason bees, and
Those-
they're just
yes.
unbelievable for being active.
Yes, and you can make little houses for mason bees. And those things. It's like you
One
just
general selling them as decorative. I asked the manager, I said, you know what those are for? He said, just decoration. I said, no, that's what mason bee reeds inside the thing, and they were selling for like $3 or $4. And you order online, you're paying $15 for them. So.
I think you can just drill holes and stuff.
As long as it's the right size.
Yeah, as long as it's the right size.
5/16. That's the magic size.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, do you do any spraying out?
We sometimes we will spray with we'll use some neem oil, which neem is basically makes it's for things that are eating the plant foliage specifically. So even the codling moth and the apple maggot, aphids, those tent caterpillars, anything that's sort of a pest that eats the plant itself, the neem oil works really good to stop their molting cycle so they won't move on to the next stage. And that gets used at a very low concentration. It's like 1%. And it's mostly during that time when the plant is open and susceptible. During flowering is very important. And then throughout the season, mostly during the summer. Sometimes we also spray some kelp. We've sprayed fish emulsion in the past during the summer, just when we want to get a little bit more growth. As far as spraying for diseases, there are several products out there that we haven't had to use yet. So there's a product called Regalia that is used for all of the fungal and bacterial pathogens. It's actually made from Japanese knotweed, which is a sort of an invasive species that grows all over here.
Very invasive.
Very invasive, yes. So there's chemicals in that plant that boost the immune system of other plants, basically. It's kind of expensive, but I buy it at DNS. I've got it for other orchards that I've been managing, and that's worked very well. And that's even on diseases on like cherries and plums where there's really heavy disease pressure. And it's a lot harder to get a good crop from year to year than it is on apples. So it's worked really well. It's called Regalia. And that's at DNS Organics down in Mespo. They sell that.
Is there any way to tell what kind of apple trees you have, or are they just so cross-pollinated?
Yeah, so that what you want to do if you're looking for a variety is look for where it was grafted. There will be a line on these big old trees where the bark changes, and that's where the variety was grafted onto the rootstock. So you'll have a different tree growing on the roots than what the roots are, right? And there will be a line right there that should tell you if it's a variety. If it's not a variety and it's just a seedling, well, it is what it is. It's a unique individual. It's not a variety, right? So it's going to be like you or me. Like we're all different.
These are 40-some-year-old trees at least.
Well, see if you find a graft union, and if you don't, then they might just be wild, like seedlings from an orchard, which means they could be amazing. I mean, there are people that scour the country looking for old heirloom apple varieties. So Fedco is doing this throughout the Northeast, and they have a heritage orchard. And they have trees that are on their most wanted list, right, that they're looking for. that they know were grown there. They can find the historical records, and we can do that too. I'm sure the Historical Society has records that would help us in this respect. This individual put in 1,000 of these trees on this address, and we're seeing the remnants of that. Actually, Clay Street between 307 and Geneva, there are several places in through there that are definitely old apple orchards. There's just like pieces and parts, there's some grafted trees, there's wild trees, and they're all, you can still sort of see the rows, Things are a little wonky, but, so we have the stuff's left over. The Apples of North America, that book that I have, would be a good place to start. And that's part of a compendium. There are 8-10 volumes of 400 pages each of just different apple varieties. Because they weren't just growing them for what they call dessert quality fruit, which are the ones we buy in the grocery store that we eat right away. They were also growing apples for hard cider. They were growing apples for animal forage, right? So there was a big thing back in the day for growing fruit for pigs and for sheep and for cows. Like I was telling her earlier, when that fruit starts to rot on the ground and it starts to ferment, it brings in everything. You go to Africa and there are elephants getting drunk on jackfruit the same kind of way. Because they smell it, they get in there and they just have a good old time. So the animals want to eat that stuff. And people were breeding for trees that were dropping fruit throughout the season for the animals. So that they didn't have to buy much grain, right? So people were always looking for different ways to use the trees. And that's why we have apples that don't always taste all that good. Because really they were probably for some other purpose. And we just need to explore it a little bit, right? Go ahead.
Could you name a few varieties of apples that would do well in this area?
Sure. So the early transparent apple is an early one that came from Russia, and I've seen it around. There's one that's growing just a few miles south of here that's old, right near where Maple Road comes into 193. It's where we turn to go to our place. There's a big old, it's called early transparent, and there you can buy that variety through Fedco. Another great one that's a later apple is Macoun. The apple book that I have has a lot of them in it. There is a whole Baldwin, which is a great apple. There's Macintosh will grow here just fine. As you get further south, Macintosh is not very happy. Empire is a great disease-resistant apple. Liberty is another disease-resistant apple from Cornell. There's a lot of them. I don't have them all off the top of my head right now. But that Fedco sells a lot of them, and the book that I have back there, Apples of North America, has a lot of them as well. Apples are an important crop.
Fedco's F-E-D-C-O?
Fedco, yes. Fedco trees.
So John, I just want to mention that the Kingsville Library is part of CleveNet, which we're part of 44 library systems. So the book, Growing Fruit Trees, is in our system. There's a couple copies available, so you can always place holds on them. We'll get them in if we don't have it. I'm actually going to order those books that you mentioned today because I see they're available.
I have the one back there.
Yeah, so utilize, you do. So utilize your library. It doesn't matter if you're in Jefferson, use Henderson Library.
Yes.
We can get you these items. There's another really interesting book I wanted to mention because you were talking about the relationship between trees. And let me see, it's called The Hidden Life of Trees. And this gentleman, I believe he's from Germany, it was written in German first. He talks about how trees talk to each other and how the moss talks to each other and really the whole life system of trees that a lot of people don't realize, and it was really exciting to hear you talk about that today with, them releasing different, what did you call it? Were they pheromones?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and we do have that book in the library, so
Nice.
just want to throw that out there as well. The Hidden Life of Trees.
We use the interlibrary loan system a lot because we are going through a lot of books, and I'm trying to get to the nitty-gritty. I want to find books that are really appeal to me or that I'm into, so I have to go through a lot of them to find the good ones, I guess. But this one, like she said, is I have it right now, so if you order, you're going to be taking it away from me.
No, there's 3 more out
Oh, there's
there.
3 more?
Yes, and then
Oh, that's perfect.
I'll get one for our library too, then we'll have
I rely on the fact that nobody else is taking out this book during the year. I can like keep it for 3 months or something. I have books for a long time. This is the one that has the varieties. It's called Apples of North America. A lot of them were grown at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello property. He was really into fruit. But many of those varieties were disseminated throughout the Northeast and the Midwest and became major varieties for us. So that one is really good. And it's just the beginning. There are, like I said, there are 4-volume compendiums of 400 pages of just descriptions of different apple varieties that were brought here. So that one's kind of neat if you're into that, looking for those old varieties. This one from Michael Phillips, like I said, is really, really good. This sort of it's a lot about biological orcharding, and orcharding basically without herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, all that sort of stuff. And he's leading the way. He has all kinds of forums online, if you're into that, getting information that way, that sort of update the information from the book. So if you have questions, if you read the book, you have questions, you can go on their forums and get all the answers. This one is it's called Growing Fruit in the Upper Midwest, and this is good for people that are in sort of cold climates like us. So if you're worried about whether or not a plant is going to do well, look for it growing in Vermont or Minnesota or some of these other places.
Alaska.
What's that?
Alaska.
Yeah. Those, if it can hang in these colder places, a lot of times the plants can grow here really too. So this one's for cold climates specifically, but it's good.
And John, you're gonna have plants for sale at our farm in May and June.
Yep, not fruit trees, but we'll have all the supporting species that I'm talking about. I didn't really talk about them today because we didn't get into it. But flowering plants, herbs, perennial vegetables, all the sort of supporting plants that you want flowering throughout the season so that you're bringing in insects and the birds and everything.
And if you didn't see it, I have a sign-up sheet for the farm, the Red Beet Row, and I did find some flyers finally that I stuck over there if you want that. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Thank you, John and Stephanie.
I appreciate y'all coming.